A member of Parliament defects to reform from the Conservatives. So just how much trouble are Britain's historically most successful political party in now? Hello, it's Adam in the newscast studio.
And it is Chris in a studio at Westminster, but not the usual one I sit in because it's just gone pop and it doesn't work and there's lots of people looking in cupboards full of lots of electronic gizmos. So I'm in another little studio instead.
You do sound a little bit echoey, actually, in my headphones. Yeah, but I'm sure that's still good quality content.
I'm glad to hear it.
Is it true Ed Miliband was in this studio before it went mysteriously dark?
Oh, was he really? Oh, right.
Not much energy security in there.
Is that right? No, I was in it at lunchtime and it seemed fine and dandy. It gets quite a pounding, that studio, for various programmes.
Well used.
It gets well used. But yeah, we'll just have to do with this little backup one, which is actually, this is the spot where Henry Zeffman often sits at the crack of dawn when he's talking to BBC Breakfast.
I've got strong memories of that studio.
Oh, yes.
Not necessarily
yes,
happy ones.
This is the Adam Fleming chair, yes.
Talking of news that broke in the morning, another defection to reform. This time, a Conservative MP, like a sitting Conservative in Parliament.
Yeah, so we were all summoned or invited to a hotel in Mayfair in central London. And reading the rooms beforehand, I got the impression, so Reform do lots of press conferences, almost kind of one a week sometimes. And they often talk about a big announcement, and because they're trying to lure people along. And I just thought, I spoke to a few people. And I thought, I think this is could be quite a big one. So I decided to go along. And then what they'd managed to do, and they've got a knack for this really, is managing to avoid these things leaking. So we're all there waiting for Nigel Farage and whoever his mysterious or mystery guest is to turn up. And we don't know who it's going to be. People are saying, could it be Liz Truss? Could it be Suella Braverman? Both former senior Conservatives who've often said that they wouldn't want to necessarily make any kind of leap from their political homes. But, who knows? What's the big reveal going to be? And then the reveal came, and it was a guy called Danny Kruger, who was a shadow minister until this morning and is now joining Reform, appearing on a Reform stage, elected on a Conservative ticket at the general election. He's not going to call a by-election in his seat in Wiltshire. And he's been brought in because, I think Nigel Farage and Reform get that they need to, they're trying to, expand at lightning pace, and they need more, they think, kind of intellectual heft and rigour in the whole process of what their policy outlook is and all the rest of it. And they think that Danny Kruger can help bring that to them. But it's always a moment, Adam, when someone defects. I know people switching how they vote from one election to the another is kind of what defines a democracy, really. But in such a tribal postcode like this one, Westminster, it is a big deal because leaving a party that is such a massive part of your identity and joining another one burns bridges and causes offence and it causes upset and then it causes delight in the new party. So it is a big old thing for someone to do.
And here is the moment that Danny Kruger announced he was making this flit.
We've had a year of stasis and drift and the sham unity that comes from not doing anything bold or difficult or controversial. And the result is in the polls. And those lost voters aren't coming back. And every day, more and more people are joining them in deserting the party that has failed. And so this is my tragic conclusion. The Conservative Party is over. Over as a national party. Over as the principal opposition to the left.
And Chris, Danny Kruger might not be a kind of household name in politics, but he was kind of as plugged into the Tory party as you could get. I mean, I'm thinking about the first time I ever became aware of him was when David Cameron was in opposition and he did that speech that became known as the Hug a Hoodie speech, which was never actually in the speech, but he was talking about actually maybe you needed to show young offenders a bit of love rather than just automatically writing them off. And Danny Kruger had written that speech.
Yeah, he wrote that speech from nearly 20 years ago when the Conservatives at the time, having just lost 3 elections in a row, were attempting to revive and rebrand themselves, change the impression that people had of them. They had this young, ambitious leader in David Cameron and a speechwriter called Danny Kruger, who wrote that speech and faced questions about it today because people were saying, oh, so you wrote that speech for David Cameron and then you went to work for Boris Johnson in Downing Street. This was before he was an MP. This is quite the political journey. And Danny Kruger's argument was that Hugger Huddy speech, as it became known, was instinctively conservative, and it was something that he sort of still believes in now. But he thinks the Tory party is finished. He thinks it cannot revive. He thinks that reform is effectively its successor broadly on the right of politics. But yeah, Danny Kruger is someone who is steeped in conservative politics. Big C until this morning, small c still now. He kept saying conservative and over again in the news conference, which I thought was
yes, because he said that that the reason he was moving to reform was that was the best place for conservatism to be now.
Yes,
and that almost like the Conservative Party was just like, oh, a car, you sold the car and you bought another one.
Yeah, completely. And I thought that was interesting. He kept using the word conservative in so many of his answers. And, you know, of course, when you get a defection, almost always it's a boon for the party that is getting the defectee, and it's a wound for the party that is losing the person who has gone. But there is also, and I asked Nigel Farage about this, a question to be put to reform about how you simultaneously portray yourselves as this insurgency that is trying to tear up the dominance of the two big parties at Westminster, Labour and Conservative, etc., etc. And yet, disproportionately, the people you are luring towards you, particularly the bigger figures who had a previous party affiliation beyond who they voted for in an election, are Conservatives. And so are you just attracting Conservatives who have concluded that their previous home is no longer for them for all sorts of reasons, not least one that might conclude that they're finished, that they're just not going to go anywhere electorally, which is a big part of the Danny Kruger argument. And to what extent does that kind of dilute your sense of being this bright new insurgency if you every other week are welcoming former Conservatives, some of whom were in government only recently? You think of Nadine Dorries, for instance, the former cabinet minister, unveiled a couple of weeks back. So that's a challenge for reform, no doubt. But then it's, from their perspective, almost a nice question to have, because if you're trying to demonstrate growth and trying to demonstrate a sense of the other parties being winded and wounded, luring people from them, it helps you do that.
And of course, if you're joining a political party that a day before was one of your opponents, then it's quite easy to find old clips where you'd criticised your new bedfellows. And you raised that with Danny Kruger when you were chatting to him after the announcement. Let's have a listen.
You said in July that the problem with reform is they would spend like drunken sailors. What's drawn you to the drunk sailors?
So what I was talking about then was their commitments on welfare spending, which I was very concerned about. But I'm glad to say that at the party conference that Reform held a few weeks ago, Nigel Farage said that we needed to bring down welfare spending. So I am confident that they are committed to fiscal responsibility.
Isn't the truth, though, that they are making some big spending promises? Think of the steel industry and other ideas that they have. Just how conservative is this party that you've just joined?
Well, listen, we do need to invest in the industrial infrastructure of our country. That is part of the problem that we have. But we also need to grow the economy through supporting entrepreneurs in particular, cutting the regulations and the taxation that holds our economy back. So, of course, it's right to spend where appropriate, particularly to build up our critical national infrastructure.
What did you think of how he handled that?
So, I mean, I think on the specific, he had that answer, didn't he, about what Nigel Farage had said, particularly about about welfare policy that Reform had set out at their conference in Birmingham a week or so ago. I think it is a point of ongoing scrutiny for Reform about, and again, these labels left and right only get us so far, as we regularly discuss on newscasts, but in many senses, Reform's instincts are quite big spending. Now, people will have a view about whether they like that or they don't, but it's quite a long way from Danny Kruger's instincts. Now, he says he believes that they are, as he would see it, sufficiently entrepreneurial in their instincts, sufficiently small state in their instincts, that their instincts and his politically overlap. Incidentally, on not having a by-election in his seat in Wiltshire, he argued that the reason there was no need for that is that it wouldn't change how he voted, that his voting would be exactly the same because of the overlap of his outlook with reforms. But yeah, that wider question about reform and the promises they are making around spending, I think that's gonna crank up. Now, for some people that will be very popular, by the way, of course, and for others much less so. But then there's a job of scrutiny to be done about the credibility of those arguments in the context of the kind of fiscal backdrop, as the economists would put it, the sort of state of the country's balance sheet in the late 2020s at the time of the next election, where they hope they might assume office.
One of the really interesting things about this is that Danny Kruger is very comfortable talking about his faith. About being a Christian in politics. And actually that goes back to the Cameron Hugger-Hoody speech, because that was about love and compassion. And okay, that might not have been couched as a Christian thing, but it is a kind of Christian thing. And so I do wonder if now we're going to see reform kind of moving into that space as well. And so like a wider definition of the Britishness that reform talk about.
Yeah,
Which also is especially interesting if there is a bit of a revival of people going to church a bit more.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting, this, and because reform with their the kind of words that they will home in on, that you'll see on their stages and lecterns and whatever, have been talking about community and family and country. Now, to part country for a bit, they would make the argument about patriotism and all of that. Family and community. Now, in many senses, that's, I guess, it's in the ear of the beholder, but could be a kind of secular sort of faith in the roots that bind people, the ties that bind people, which some might attach a religious significance to if they are of faith, and others might in a more secular sense. But I think there is an overlap there between Danny Kruger's conservatism, small c now, and where reform are leaning in terms of their pitch about what matters.
And also one other little wrinkle in this is that Nigel Farage says that Danny Kruger is going to help reform to prepare for government. And then Danny Kruger's critics and former friends say, well, hang on, he's never been a minister, even a junior one. But I suppose the answer to that is, well, he did work in Number 10 for Boris Johnson, and he's been close to previous leaders and prime ministers. So you don't just have to have been a minister to know how government works. And actually, if you're a junior minister, you can often be really quite a long way from the centre of power.
Yeah, and Danny Kruger was absolutely at the centre of power when he was working in Downing Street, and Reform and Nigel Farage have acknowledged that at the moment that is a clear weakness for them, that they don't have what even a party like Labour that have been out of power for a long time had, which is at least some elements of, if you like, institutional memory about how you govern. And Reform have absolutely zero as far as that is concerned. It won't surprise you, Adam.
Oh, hang on, they've got Nadine Dorries. She was a health minister and a culture secretary.
Well, indeed. Until recently, they had zero. They're having to build up, and that's an element of how they do it with their defectors. And they've got Jake Berry, who was a minister under the Conservatives too. So, but they've been building up from zero, and are still at a relatively low base. It won't surprise you that plenty of Conservatives have been happy to drip a bit of critique about their former colleague into my ear this afternoon. So one was saying, "Oh, Danny Kruger's an ideologue. He was a nightmare. It won't work well in a team, etc., etc." Somebody else made the point. I thought this was interesting, just as an observation, that quite a few of the recent defectees were very close to Boris Johnson. So you think of Sir Jake Berry, the former party chairman, where I think he is godparent to Boris Johnson's children, or the other way around. I think Boris Johnson is godparent to one of his children. Then you've got Nadine Dorries. Now you have Danny Kruger. Now, in many senses, they are very different characters, but they all have a close association with Boris Johnson. One person suggested to me that some of them, would barely have in the past sort of wiped their nose without Boris Johnson's approval. That's probably a caricature. It's clearly a caricature. But that is interesting, just in terms of that kind of overlapping kind of biography and closeness to Boris Johnson. And the way Danny Kruger, if you like, tried to sort of explain that, if you like, is that he was a big fan of Boris Johnson up to and including the victory in 2019, but then felt that in government, after that election win, in his view, he kind of went wayward. And, we saw the big increase in immigration numbers, for instance, which plenty within Reform see as a big mistake. But yeah, it's just intriguing in terms of the sort of biographies and previous affiliations of recent Reform defectees.
And
or is it defectors?
Defectee sounds like there might be something wrong with you, rather than you've just defected. Let's hear how the Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch dealt with this.
Danny has made his case very clear that this is not about me. I can't be distracted by that, and I'm not going to get blown off course by these sorts of incidents. I know that this is the sort of thing that is going to happen while a party is changing. I am making sure that people understand what Conservative values are. It means living within our means. It means making sure that we are growing our economy. It means not wasting money on things like net zero, which are bankrupting the country, not wasting money on welfare to the people who shouldn't get it at the same time as we're not able to give it to those who need to get it. That's what we're very focused on now. And what I need to do is make sure that the public understands what today's Conservative Party is about, not yesterday's Conservative Party.
What I think is intriguing, Crystal, is not just a pressure on Kemi Badenoch, but pressure on Robert Jenrick, because Danny Kruger was also quite close to Robert Jenrick. And so I've seen David Frost, Boris Johnson's former Brexit advisor, writing in the Telegraph saying, oh, actually, this is a signal that people who were maybe waiting for Robert Jenrick to take over the Conservative Party in their dreams, that they think that's not going to happen.
Yeah, and I think, there's a bigger picture point here, which is that Reform are leading the other political parties, plenty of the other political parties, into sort of anguish and contortions that are all symptomatic of the stickiness of Reform's current popularity. So you have the Conservatives, another person defects, awkward questions for Kemi Badenoch. Did the party pick the right leader in that contest a year ago? Is it now too late for Robert Jenrick, which is the argument that Danny Kruger was making? You have Labour caught in this dreadful 2 weeks they've had with Angela Rayner and then with Lord Mandelson and the questions that are still being thrown at the Prime Minister around all of that. But the jitters that we're hearing from Labour MPs who are saying, oh gosh, is Keir Starmer up to the job? What about the local elections and the devolved elections next May? Maybe after that there has to be a reckoning. All that kind of stuff, of which there's been a lot publicly and privately over the weekend. The Lib Dems too, their anguish that despite having a record number of MPs, they feel they don't get enough attention. All of those things are symptomatic of the rise of Reform. And I think it's sort of the prism now through which, we can see a lot of our politics, and particularly how the other parties are doing their thing. They're doing their thing in response to Reform. Now, that's not to oversell where Reform are. They've got a tiny number of MPs, given where they want to get to. They've got massive questions about how they scale up. There's all sorts of scrutiny, including on the BBC in the last couple of days around Nigel Farage and the whole business of the house that his partner bought in Clacton in Essex and his constituency. So there's vast scrutiny already beginning to happen and will scale up if they remain as significant a player as they currently are. But it is also true right now, albeit still early in this parliamentary term, that they are making the political weather and they are leading to a lot of the things we are then seeing from the other parties.
Right, so let's talk about the government. Keir Starmer has actually been in front of the microphones answering questions, which he hasn't done a lot of since he sacked Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, as ambassador to Washington, D.C. Let's hear a little bit of what he had to say today.
Peter Mandelson, before he was appointed, went through a due diligence process. That's the propriety and ethics team went through a process. And therefore, I knew of his association with Epstein. But had I known then what I know now, I'd have never appointed him. Because what emerged last week were emails, Bloomberg emails, which showed that the nature and extent of the relationship that Peter Mandelson had with Epstein was far different to what I had understood to be the position when I appointed him. On top of that, what the email showed was he was not only questioning, but wanting to challenge the conviction of Epstein at the time. That, for me, went and cut across the whole approach that I've taken on violence against women and girls for many years, and this government's approach.
Actually, do you know what, Chris? I wonder if we just let that clip live there, because there'll be all those questions coming from Parliament on Tuesday, and we can see how that SO24 debate actually plays out on Tuesday, maybe.
Good idea.
But that isn't to say there isn't other stuff to talk about the state of the government.
There is plenty to talk about the state of the government. And another departure from Downing Street. It's just sort of that sense of it, it doesn't rain, it pours at the moment. And this often happens for political leaders and particular occupiers of Downing Street. So we've seen another resignation, another senior aide departing, a guy called Paul Ovenden, who was Director of Strategy. And this is over some messages, some sexually explicit messages that were shared actually the best part of a decade ago. But they have leaked now. He has apologised for them and he has resigned. And you might think, blimey, why is this happening now? From the folk I hear from in government, the reason it's happening now is because of this situation that the Labour Party finds itself in, and the recriminations that are going on, and the blame game and the factional kind of backbiting, really. Because these messages have been, people within the party have been aware of them for ages. They go back to 2017. But it's right now, in the context of the here and now and the questions that the Prime Minister faces and the questions senior figures in Downing Street face, that these things have come out, and they've come out because of all of this pressure, and this pressure that is sort of, if you like, exacerbated by the perceived threat that Labour now feel incredibly keenly from reform.
Interesting. I always think that prime ministerial authority is a bit like a stone, and when you move the stone and lift it up, there's all sorts of things underneath. And this seems to me, the last few days, like a classic thing of the stone moving.
Yeah, I think it is that. I think there is a bit of that, and it means that you might think, oh gosh, why does that come out now? For somebody in possession of something that is damaging to someone, the time that you release it is absolutely important, because something like this, out of nowhere, out of any kind of context, released perhaps in a period where the Prime Minister's not facing great questions, or perhaps is on from his perspective, a sort of positive run, it would have an implication for the person in question. If it was deemed significant enough to do that. I'm not talking about this particular case in this instance, but it would probably be lost without trace and wouldn't cause wider anguish or awkwardness or embarrassment or internal questions. If you release it as a moment of maximum potential impact, it can do all of those things. And that's what motivates people to release stuff at particular times, and that's why you are more likely to hear about this kind of thing in the current context than you might have been in others, particularly when, as in this instance, and it can often be the case in these things, the actual thing it's referring to happened some time ago, and in this instance, a long time ago.
Chris, good to catch up. And the next time we catch up, Donald Trump will be winging his way to the UK. In fact, Air Force One may even have touched down, depending on what time we speak on Tuesday.
Well, indeed. But we'll be doing our SO24 special, and never mind a state visit. We've just got to do parliamentary procedure, haven't we?
And as I said, to fill the time in between, there's a spreadsheet that goes all the way back to the first SO24 in the Parliament of 1979 to 1983. Right, speak to you soon.
Ta-ra!
And on that subject of Donald Trump's state visit to the UK, which officially begins on Wednesday morning when he will see the King and Queen in Windsor Castle, this is a great opportunity to just take the temperature of the so-called special relationship between the UK and the US. And that is exactly what new friend of Newscast, Jane Corbin, has been doing in the latest edition of Panorama, which you can watch on iPlayer right now. It's called Trump and Starmer, a special relationship ? And I've been catching up with Jane to just talk over some of the things that she's been looking into while she's been making that episode of Panorama over the last few weeks and talking to all sorts of people who have very, very good knowledge of that special relationship. And Jane Corbin is here. Hello again.
Hello again.
So, do you know what? Before we dive into your Panorama, You've covered American politics and American diplomacy and the world for quite a while. I'm thinking back to the old Newscast, you and Yasser Arafat. The special relationship, how do you conceptualize it, think about it? Sometimes I think it's a cliche and I'm like, but actually it is real. And it does matter.
Yeah, and obviously it dates back to Winston Churchill saying, we're going to be a Commonwealth and Britain is going to have this special relationship with America. And it has gone up and down depending who's been in the White House. We've had, Reagan and Thatcher got on famously, Harold Wilson and Lyndon B. Johnson less because Wilson wouldn't commit troops to Vietnam. Blair and Clinton, Blair and Bush, obviously the relationship was very, very strong. So it goes up and down depending on who's in the White House and who's in Downing Street. But it has a solid foundation, really, in defence and intelligence sharing. So it really matters at that level. Intelligence is shared between the US and Britain and what they call Five Eyes, Australia and Canada as well. But that's important, and so is defence. And I think for this president, President Trump, the issue of Britain and defence and feeling that, we could rely on each other is very important to President Trump.
And I think that one of the lines that really sticks out for me from the Panorama is Kim Darroch, the former ambassador, who says, yeah, it's all this serious stuff about intelligence sharing and military cooperation, but it really comes down to Downing Street and the Oval Office.
It does. And we remember, don't we, in Trump's first term when he, in probably a very chivalrous and charming way, grabbed hold of Theresa May's hand. And the world was shocked. You don't do that. But I think it showed something that there is a warmth in the relationship between Britain and America, that made him do that at that point, to help her up the stairs or whatever. So you're right. It comes down to personalities.
And in terms of the personalities that we're talking about now, Keir Starmer and Donald Trump, have you managed to get to the bottom of how they've ended up getting on so well, even though they are not two peas in the same pod?
Well, it goes back to before the US election. I think it was well known that quite a few Labour supporters went to work for the Democrat campaign, but this was never the position taken by the party. And David Lammy, who was then very close to Starmer, still is, and has until recently been the Foreign Secretary, told us that he advised Keir Starmer that the Republicans were running a better campaign than the Democrats, and the likelihood was that Trump would be coming back for a second term. And Lammy said to me that, we had a forensic approach to this. We were laser focused on establishing a good relationship with President Trump right from the start. And I think that's where it all began. And obviously, we're in a world of great uncertainties, particularly with Ukraine and with Russia. And I think Keir Starmer sees his mission as keeping close to Donald Trump in these very uncertain times.
And it's interesting when you look at what Starmer has achieved with Trump, because I think we take a lot of these things for granted. We take it for granted that they've got on quite well and that the UK gets preferential treatment when it comes to trade compared to everyone else. We sort of bank that and move it on. But actually, that had to be achieved.
Yeah, and if you look back to earlier this year, Starmer was one of the first people into the Oval Office after Trump won and took possession of the Oval Office in January. And I think trade was high on everybody's minds.
Thank you. So does that mean there won't be any sanctions on the UK then?
We'll have to take a look. We're going to have a good discussion today, and we have some very talented people on the other side, and we have some people that probably aren't as talented as them, but they're pretty good. Marco, what do you think? Our people are pretty good. And no, we're going to have a good discussion, and we'll be talking about that.
And it wasn't a done deal by any means necessarily. And it's been up and down and back and forward. And although we do seem to have been able to soften the blow on trade tariffs, the UK has 10% versus 25% for the EU.
There is still a blow.
It's still a blow, but it's still a lot lower than some countries. So that wasn't a given that would happen. But also, as several of the contributors to the programme tonight say, is you need to keep an eye on the small print with Donald Trump. You're never quite sure. And Ed Davey, the Liberal Democrat leader, pointed out to us that, yes, it's an agreed trade deal, but nothing's been signed or formalised. And, for example, on steel, and I think that Trump and Starmer are going to talk about this in the state visit this week, steel, the tariff is 25%, and that's really impacting, the British car industry, diggers, the JCB, Bamford. Some of the industrialists have complained that this 25% is really hurting.
And then when we talk about international security, like Starmer was quite instrumental in getting not just Zelensky, but all those other European leaders into the room with Trump a couple of weeks ago, just post the meeting in Alaska with Putin. Yeah,
and I think the fallout from that earlier visit that Zelensky made to the White House, where this terrible, row erupted, and the treatment that he received at the hands of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, I think shocked European leaders, including Keir Starmer, who's worked very hard. And right the next day, he made sure that Zelensky came to London, and I think the King had tea with him as well. There was a sort of push to show Trump.
And there was the hug.
And the hug in Downing Street. This cannot stand. And then from that moment on, according to people in our programme and David Lammy, Starmer has worked very hard with President Macron of France to get Zelensky back into the White House. And we saw that, as you say, a couple of weeks ago, bolstered by a whole raft of European leaders and the head of NATO accompanying Zelensky to Washington to join him with President Trump and send a strong message. We're in this together.
Although one of the costs of doing business with Trump for Starmer is kind of biting his lip on quite a lot.
Yeah, and I saw that. I was in Scotland when Trump came for a so-called private visit a month or so back. It wasn't very private.
No.
And I think Keir Starmer had to sit there for 90 minutes and hardly said anything and did a lot of listening. And there was an awkward moment when President Trump attacked the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, saying he was a nasty man.
I think he's done a terrible job, the mayor of London, but a nasty person. I think he's a friend of mine.
And Starmer had to sort of sat there and then interjected, he's my friend. But he didn't really say a lot more than that. And you got the feeling, he was definitely having to bite his tongue some of the time.
I said bite your lip. It's bite your tongue, isn't it?
Is it bite your tongue? It's probably biting his lip as well.
Yeah, a lot of biting when Trump's in town. And it's interesting, that visit to Scotland, because, I've said a few times, I got it wrong. I thought because he was coming to play golf, he would basically be on holiday, he'd disappear, we'd see him playing golf, and that would be it. I didn't realise it would be 24/7 Trump world, deal-making, diplomacy happening. So it shows how much I know. But
one of the interesting things was not only was Starmer there very quickly, hot on the president's heels, but Ursula von der Leyen came very quickly. And, we were there, and I tell you, it was motorcade after motorcade after motorcade arriving at Turnberry.
Definitely not a holiday.
Who's coming to tea?
What was intriguing, though, is when you speak to people around about that golf course, you'd expect everyone would be annoyed about the logistics of not being able to get to the shops because of the motorcades and the barriers, and people being annoyed that Donald Trump is such a big beast in their backyard. But actually, you speak to people who are actually very pleased that he's invested in that bit of Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, saying that we need him and jobs, and he's brought jobs, although others say he promised jobs and things that didn't materialise. So there's two views there. And I think it's also, several people said to us, we can't afford to antagonise him. He's a very important person, and he's been good for Scotland. And he is very proud of his Scottish roots. His mother's Scottish, and he refers to it all the time. And, what's not to like for people in Turnberry, although we did find some people who had met him on a personal level and said that one lady in particular said he's not a very nice man. So we had a real sort of range of opinions there in Scotland.
But you speak to other people kind of at other levels of the diplomatic pyramid who say he's incredibly charismatic.
Yeah. Yes. Jeremy Hunt, who dealt with him a lot, was Foreign Secretary in the Conservative government, said he's charismatic and, he fills the room. And people, and I think Kim Darroch, who you referred to, who was our previous ambassador, who had to leave under a cloud because he upset Donald Trump when he was a bit undiplomatic about him. He said his officials are quite frightened of him. But on another level, he definitely is, a big figure, and he dares to do things and take decisions, and he's not a cardboard cutout politician. And I think we can all agree with that.
Yeah, and you speak to that former advisor of his who says the thing about Donald Trump is the one you get in public is the same as you get in private, and there's a value to that, even if people find some of the things he says quite offensive.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting. In preparation for the film, I went back and read The Art of the Deal, which is Donald Trump's book.
Oh, that was my holiday reading at the start of the year.
And I tell you, it's so illuminating.
Yes.
What he did as a businessman, he is absolutely doing now as a politician. Really interesting. And yes, indeed, his Katie McFarland, who was one of his advisors in the first term, she said that. She said he may zig and he may zag, but he gets to the end point and he is absolutely true to what he says in private is what he says in public. And I think we saw that, didn't we, in the Oval Office with Zelensky? Obviously, that's what President Trump felt, and he said it. No diplomatic niceties.
And in terms of back to the UK, you went and spoke to some of the people who are protesting outside the migrant hotels. What was the link between those people protesting against the temporary housing for asylum seekers and the MAGA movement? What did you find?
Well, we've seen Donald Trump crack down on illegal migration right across the states. And he has been really outspoken about it, and we've had the issues with the border and, you know where Donald Trump is coming from. And I think what's happened here is as the protests have spread over the summer across the UK about housing asylum seekers in hotels and the numbers have gone up, we have seen actually the social media out of Downing Street beginning to almost learn lessons from some of the things that Donald Trump has said, particularly in the wording and the phrases used. So, for example, you see them saying, showing pictures of handcuffs, or saying we've deported thousands of people. This is Downing Street. And this isn't perhaps the language you would normally expect from a British Prime Minister. And it is, some see, it is an echo of what Donald Trump is saying. And some of the political commentators we spoke to called it the Trumpification of political language in Britain. And it cuts through in a way that Trump cuts through, and perhaps politicians on this side of the Atlantic haven't done recently.
Yeah, the polls suggest that here Donald Trump is very unpopular, but actually that doesn't mean there aren't people who do like him.
Something like the last poll taken in August showed 78% of people in the UK had an unfavourable view of Donald Trump, but that doesn't mean they have an unfavourable view of his policies.
And then looking ahead to the next few days, we're going to see a lot of him. Although, again, I'm worried I've made a hostage to fortune here, because I said it on Newscast a couple of days ago. Because it's a state visit, he's going to be a bit more constrained because it's all a bit more formal and formulaic. There's less off-the-cuff time. Yeah. But then that's me making the same mistake as I did when he came to Scotland.
Who knows? I mean, I think if anyone's going to do it, he'll do it. He'll get that off-the-cuff. He always speaks to reporters going in and out. He's never shy to do that. Now, the security issues are enormous with President Trump, and obviously we've seen 2 assassination attempts on him. And I think the decision was taken on this visit not to have the American party in Buckingham Palace and in London going down the Mall. Instead, he'll be at Windsor Castle. But there's still going to possibly be opportunities, though the public will be more at arm's length. But I think people will turn out to see him and Melania Trump, yes.
Well, yeah, because there'll be the people that turn out to protest, kind of classic. There'll be the people that turn out just to have a look, because it's a total circus when a president arrives, because the motorcade is like 100 cars long. It's quite fun to watch.
And he's in the Beast.
Yeah.
The big armored
limo. Although they have
limo.
2, I think, don't they?
Yeah.
Like, there's a decoy beast.
Yeah, so...
But
there's definitely a couple of beasts.
Yeah, but then I think what will be really intriguing is how many people turn up who are pro-Trump and have the red replica MAGA hats, because you saw that in Scotland.
Yeah, we did. And people had come from, there weren't large numbers of them, probably half a dozen, but they were very vocal, and they'd come from Edinburgh, from Blackburn, from Manchester, from Liverpool. And they were, wearing their red MAGA caps, saying we support Trump, we support everything you do. And there will be those people, the MAGA supporters, the British version of, coming out to greet him in Windsor, I'm sure.
Yeah, although it's interesting that point you make there, that just because we're surprised that those people are there, because the sort of the polling evidence would suggest there's not very many of them, actually we shouldn't exaggerate kind of like the MAGA in the UK movement.
No, but, I think when I saw them, was a fairly remote part of Scotland, quite hard to get to.
Yeah.
Now, maybe, Windsor, not so far from London, easier people to turn up. You might get a larger number, potentially. I don't know.
I think what will be intriguing in kind of policy terms is, I think the centerpiece that they were planning before Mandelson resigned was this sort of tech cooperation deal, data sharing, helping like big tech companies invest in the UK. I wonder, how much of that has survived the last few days from Mandelson's departure? Because it felt like quite a kind of passion project of his.
There are tensions there because the Online Safety Bill, an Online Safety Act that this British government is very, wedded to, has created some issues in the States about freedom of speech, and they've been exploited, some would say, by the likes of Elon Musk. So there's also the question of the digital tax on the big, the tech bros, which Trump is very against, and yet it's something that our government is, it's going to happen, I think. So that whole tech area has a lot of room for, cooperation. It can be also divisive. So we're probably going to see that develop in the next few days as well.
And you also just realise like the new world we're in, because I'm thinking back to when JD Vance was here for his summer holiday and he was in the Cotswolds and he had a barbecue with lots of British political types. And one of the Conservative MPs who was there was Danny Kruger, who today has defected to Reform. So
yes,
it's all getting scrambled.
Yeah, and, David Lammy famously had the barbecue with JD Vance at Chevening, and they went fishing together, although it later transpired that David Lammy didn't have a license.
Apparently he does now.
I was there the following day with David Lammy, and he wasn't quite aware of the
Did he offer you some fish?
No, he wasn't aware of the fishing license problem. We were sitting, he said, you're sitting right where JD Vance sat. But
that's another thing that's scrambled, though, isn't it? Because he's now no longer the Foreign Secretary, but he's the guy with JD Vance on speed dial.
And the two families, get on very well. I understand that David Lammy will continue. He's Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Minister now. He will continue to handle that relationship with JD Vance, and I suspect with Trump as well. Keir Starmer will want to keep that closeness that's been created unlikely closeness, some would say, between the Labour Party and the Trump administration. He'd like to keep that going.
What are you working on next?
Oh, I don't know. Various things. Yes. I mean, obviously, we've talked a lot about the Middle East before. I'm hoping, like most journalists in this field, that I will be able to go to Gaza soon and actually report for the first time in 2 years on what is going on there and the situation on the ground. Because although we have wonderful, brave colleagues, Palestinian colleagues, who are continuing to report from inside Gaza, for us, there's no real substitute for going and seeing it. So I'm hoping that I may be able to go to Gaza next.
And that reminds me of that excellent episode of Old Newscast we did about the Oslo Accords for the two-state solution. And of course, we're on the verge of the UK and many other countries recognising a Palestinian state, which would be the kind of the culmination of that peace process, but being delivered in a very kind of different context and different way.
And without the say-so of the Israelis. The whole Oslo two-state solution was that both sides would recognise each other and both would move
to live
together.
Yeah.
Now we've got a situation where, Britain is likely to recognise it, as is Canada and Australia and others at the UN General Assembly in the next week or so. But Israel is not in that space. So it's questionable.
And neither is the US.
And neither is Trump. What will that actually mean? It is, some would say, just a gesture of solidarity with the Palestinians, but it won't make any difference on the ground in Gaza.
Jane, thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam.